So my theme tonight has been given to me by Satyadasa, who's setting my exam for this visit. And the theme is people talk a lot about compassion, but what really is it? So I'm going to start a bit personally. I've been very fortunate in my life. I've experienced very little personal suffering. The normal sufferings that everybody's heir to. Those girlfriends who didn't realise my wonder and dropped me, and that sort of thing, which seems like the end of the world, but is in the larger scale of things fairly minor. At the time, of course, it doesn't feel like that. But not really much direct suffering. I've had a relatively privileged background. I've not even witnessed much suffering directly. Of course, I see it on the news and so forth, but I haven't had much direct, immediate contact with it. And I'm aware that some of you will have. Some of you will have experienced personal suffering and will have witnessed around you terrible suffering. But I want to talk about two incidents in my own life, not because it's not good, really, in a way, to talk too much about such unpleasant things, but because I want to examine my own responses in order to try to get at what compassion is and what compassion isn't. So forgive me for talking about things that are not very pleasant, but sometimes we have to do that. So the first incident happened in 2006. It's the anniversary of Dr. Ambedkar's conversion to Buddhism in India. He converted in 1956 to get out of the oppressions of caste, having been born into a background which at that time was considered untouchable, really bottom of the caste system. So he led millions of his followers into Buddhism because there's no caste in Buddhism, whereas it's integral to Hinduism. So he converted in Nagpur on the 14th of October 1956, and then 2 days later he did a big conversion ceremony at a nearby town called Chandrapur. And in Nagpur, something like 400,000 people converted. In Chandrapur, about 200,000. So it was the 50th anniversary in 2006, and I was invited to give a talk at Chandrapur, the second place where the conversions took place. And so I stood up in front of a crowd of probably 150,000 people. You can't imagine what that's like. Well, you can. It's just like this, but a lot more. And all you can see is just a sea of faces into the shadows, as it were, because it was at night. So I did my half-hour talk. All the time I was talking, people were putting notes on my desk saying, "Finish now, please. Finish now, please." I wasn't, unfortunately. I can't boast the main speaker. And there were rather a lot of them. But anyway, I did my talk. I think I said some things that were quite useful. Some people seemed to appreciate it. And then I went to stay at a government rest house. My friends had organised a bed for me, a room for me, in a government rest house. It's actually a circuit rest house, so where the judges used to stay on their circuit around their districts. And the next day I got up feeling pretty pleased with myself. I'd acquitted myself fairly well in front of this large audience, and it's a bit of a buzz anyway, speaking to so many people. And the order member who was with me, Kumarajiv, who's my translator, came and said to me, "Look, there's some people who are very desperate to see you." I didn't really want to see anybody. We had to go. I wasn't in the mood for it. But, if somebody asks, you have to sort of have some response. So I said, "Find out what they want." So he went away and he came back looking ashen. He said, "Look, I really think you need to listen to them." And so I sat down with a man and people who'd come with him, and he described to me an atrocity, a caste-based atrocity that he had suffered just 2 or 3 days before. In his village, it's a famous incident now, Kalanji in Maharashtra. He'd managed to hide when all other members of the village came and basically killed all his family and raped the women. And he was hiding, and of course, terrible guilt about that because nothing he could do. At the same time, he should have been there. If they'd got him, they would have killed him. Then, of course, the police concluded that what had happened was a Naxalite atrocity, a Maoist insurgency atrocity. It's nothing to do with that. It was a caste-based incident, which was pretty extreme, but not at all uncommon. So I'm listening to this, and I realise I've just gone completely numb. I can't really take in what I'm being told. I could sort of see it, but I had no feeling response. It was just too much. And then I had this sort of feeling, I should have some response. There's something called for from me. But not. It was more of a social response, you know what I mean? People will expect me to have some response. They will expect me to have some response. I had no idea what to do. What am I to do with that information? So I sort of mumbled my way through it, and, you know, because saying you're sorry is completely inadequate to the situation. I tried to sort of find my way out of it as best I could. It's not something I look back on with a great feeling of pride. I didn't really rise to the occasion. It was out of my depth. I was out of my depth. What I felt I must do something. But again, most of my feeling I must do something was because of my own inadequacy to the situation, if you see what I mean. It was more that I felt bad about not having the appropriate response. So I thought I must try to do something. I had something that I could do. I rang some friends connected with our order who run an advocacy unit in Pune, which is especially concerned with caste-based atrocity and caste incidents, of which there are numerous in India, despite what you're told. It's an everyday occurrence. And so I did what I could, but I have to say, I'm not very proud of my response at the time. And I have thought about it quite a bit since. And I've come to certain conclusions, but I'm not going to tell you them yet. I'm going to tell you another incident, and then we'll pass on from this. This is not quite so dramatically horrible, but it's pretty awful. Some of you may know that I visit a group of Roma in Hungary, some of whom are Buddhists, and many of whom are interested in Dr. Ambedkar and his work because they see a similarity between their situation and the situation of Dalits in India. And actually, of course, they are of an Indian background. Those who speak Romani, I can understand some of what they're saying because it's clearly connected with Hindi. Anyway, I was visiting our friends, and I know the situations they come from, and there's some pretty awful situations. And, you know, I know from them the sort of things that they suffer. And they wanted to take me across the border into Slovakia, where they had some work going on. And they took me to a town called Moldova nad Bodvu in southern Slovakia, which used to be part of Hungary. And a lot of Hungarians think it still is. And so these people were in Slovakia. Their home language was Romani, a relative of Indian languages. Their language of education was Hungarian, and they were in Slovakia. So they were very, very disadvantaged and marginalized. When we got there, we drove through Slovakia, which is, you know, it's not Britain. It's not as wealthy as Britain, but it's definitely first world. It's developed, and the roads are good. In fact, the roads are better than Hungary, as the Hungarians immediately pointed out to me. And you know, the houses look neat and tidy and relatively new and so forth. It looks fairly well provided for. Say what you like about communism, but it did provide good housing and so forth by and large. And then we went through the town of Moldova and then turned off into the sort of backwoods, and about probably a mile and a half away, there was the Gypsy settlement, the Roma settlement. So it was a real ghetto. It was separated from the main community. And it was awful. As you know, I work in India. I've spent the last 30 or more years, roughly half my time in India, up until recently. And I've seen some, bad conditions in India. I've seen slums in India. But there's something about seeing it in Europe, in the midst of the normal conditions of a European economy, seeing that degree of poverty, marginalization, and just complete loss of hope. Actually, they were very, very nice to us, very welcoming, because we were with our friends who were Roma, who had come from similar circumstances themselves, so they had a connection with us, and they were so nice to us. But the conditions were really shocking. They were living in what was basically a rubbish heap, in old buildings that had been condemned, with stairs without banisters, often no doors, no windows, and an open sewer running through the middle of the settlement. And more people coming into the settlement who are living in shacks, just made from scraps from here and there. And as we came in, I remember there's a line of young people leaning against the wall, totally bounced, whatever the modern word is, stoned on glue or solvents. It's nothing else. Such a dance has been there with me. Again, how do you respond to something like that? When I come from relative wealth, not real wealth, but relative comfort, I've never had to worry about money. Doors have always opened for me. From a middle class background, white middle class background, so no real opposition in my life, no difficulties in my life. They're suddenly faced by people who have absolutely no prospects, and really no prospects. The police regularly raid, and they just beat up the men, the young men, just, to keep them, so they know where they stand, as it were. And this time, my immediate response was, I've got to stay here. I've got to stay here and help them. I've got to do something for them. And as we drove away, the sort of plans were forming in my mind. After a while, fortunately, reality shone in that I had no idea what to do. For a start, would I be able to stay in Slovakia? Actually, we were part of the European Union at that stage, Britain was. But what would I do? How would I do it? The best thing I worked out in the end was the best thing I could do was to support my Roma friends who could work with them and help them. And what they've been doing is bringing them to the schools they run in Hungary and helping them to get at least high school graduation and some to go on to university. Just in fact, this year I went again, and 2 of the Slovakian students are now at university. See whether they survive. It's very, very difficult for them. They're so different from their background. So yes, that was it was an ongoing horror, if you like, and of course I felt angry, indignant that in a relatively wealthy country, it's not Western Europe, but Slovakia is not impoverished. There are resources in the European Union, which has resources, which especially resources for those who are marginalized. This was allowed to happen. I felt really angry about it. And yes, this sort of feeling of almost desperate desire to do something. In fact, later I was invited back and I gave a talk at which the candidates for the local elections were attending. These were the Hungarian candidates, Hungarian-speaking candidates for the local elections. So I gave a talk in which I talked about the effects of Dr. Ambedkar, saying that what Dr. Ambedkar had done was to encourage people, facilitate people from these highly marginalized communities getting an education and lifting themselves out, so that now, many Dalits have achieved professional careers, are in important positions in government and so forth, because of that affirmative action, if you like. So I said to, in my talk, I said, look, I hear you all talking about the gypsy problem, Tsigani. I hear you talking about the gypsy problem. There doesn't have to be one. Because in India, people talk about the Dalit problem. But it doesn't have to be there, and we've shown that it doesn't have to be there. While I was speaking like this, the candidate in the front row firmly folded his arms and shook his head. Gypsy problem is always with us. So, yeah, I felt pretty angry about it, and personally sort of challenged by it, and felt that I had to try to do something. So, on reflection, later, reflecting on it, I realised that my responses were very mixed up, and that quite a lot of my response was not really to do with them, it was to do with me. In the Kalanji situation, it was all to do with me. I just found myself in a situation that was where I was way out of my depth, where I didn't have the appropriate responses, where I was exposed even to myself as somewhat inadequate, if you like, and I was reacting to that. Even my desire to do something was to do with sort of restoring my sense of self. My responses were mainly to do with me. And I think it was broadly the same in Slovakia. My response to the terrible situation was mainly to do with me. What I did begin to realise, particularly reflecting on the Slovakian situation, I began to sort of dig a bit deeper into my response, and maybe a little bit more mature by then. But I began to sort of distinguish different levels to my response. I could see these responses that were fundamentally selfish, even though, if I had managed to go there and do something, maybe I would have done some good, maybe I would have done some harm, but maybe I would have done something good. But it wasn't coming from the right place. It wasn't, and therefore was bound to be tainted. The work itself would be contaminated by my own selfish response. But I sort of looked a bit deeper, because I was really touched by the plight of people, and touched by their responsiveness to us. Do you remember? I remember that they were so sort of friendly and kind and responsive, even though they're living in awful circumstances. Human beings in Europe, particularly today, should not be living in. Don't have to be living in. Quite easily could not be living in. It's not so easy in India because it's a poorer country. But I saw that, yes, that there was a much more deeply human response. Much more of a sense of fellow feeling, of solidarity. These were like me. They were people like me. They were not different from me. The circumstances, conditions had turned out in a way that meant their experience was very, very different to mine, but fundamentally they were just like me. And so my response was, I think, a purer one, of human solidarity, of feeling that I did not want them to suffer in that way. I wanted them to be free from that suffering. So I tell these two stories because, as I say, I'm using myself as Exhibit A of the responses that many of us will have in that sort of situation, which when you really look at them in the cold light of day and cut away all the rhetoric, you have to say, it's really about me. It's really to do with me. And then just beginning to discern underneath that something that I think is much purer, more natural, more human, a human responsiveness to people who are just like you, who are suffering. And I've chosen to tell these two stories because my theme, the essay that Satyadasa has set me, begins with the clause that many people talk about compassion today. And I think what he's getting at is that there's a lot of quite superficial and trite talk of compassion. You ought to wash your mouth out before you use the word compassion. It's a big word. And it's trotted out, politicians and activists often. Of course, activism is necessary, but when we're socially active, we need to be careful about our motivation. I worked for a while in psychiatric social work, and I saw that so much of the motivation for being involved with that was not very pure or clear. And poor people, didn't have the chance to clarify. And I think we need to be much clearer about what compassion is and what it is not. Compassion is, by definition, not to do with me. Compassion begins when I start to get myself out of the way. When after I'd been through all my sort of horrified, anxious desire to help, my anger, my rage, and so forth, when I'd been through all that, sitting in the van on the way back through the winding borders between Slovakia and Hungary, I began to sort of feel into something much more fundamental, much more basic, much more deeply human. So this is dealt with very, very clearly in Buddhism, in the Buddha Dhamma, from the very basic Dharma. There's a great clarity about this area, about human responses, startling clarity. I remember when I first heard it, just feeling like the clouds had parted and I could see very clearly. So Buddhism speaks of 4 basic positive emotions, creative, skillful emotions. The first one, which many of you will know through coming to meditation classes, is metta or maitri, which we somewhat inadequately translate as loving kindness. We don't really have an English word that quite corresponds to it. In India it's easy because maitri means maitri. That's the word they use. So that's the first one. The second is karuna, which means compassion. The third is mudita, which means sympathetic joy, taking delight and pleasure in another person's happiness. And the final one is upeksha, which means equanimity, which means a creative non-reactivity. I say creative because non-reactivity can be the classic sort of British indifference, but it's you're not personally swayed by things. So I in Moldova, I in Chandrapur was not equanimous. I lost my centre. I lost my sense of myself. Became over-absorbed in the wrong way in the horror of it. So these 4 fundamental emotions, there's a 5th which I'll come on to, but these 4 fundamental emotions are very important for us as Buddhists to understand and be able to identify within ourselves, identify our responses. Because each of them can look like something else, what's called a near enemy. Each of these four emotions, what are called the Brahma-viharas, the four infinite dwellings, four infinitudes, it's sometimes rather clumsily called, because they're emotions that have no limit. These four infinitudes, of course, have their direct opposites. So loving kindness has hatred as its opposite. Compassion has as its opposite cruelty. Mudita, sympathetic joy, has as its opposite jealousy. And upeksha, that is equanimity, has as its opposite reactivity. But they also have near enemies. And it's very important to understand these near enemies, because in a way that's what I was telling you. I was telling you about my involvement with the near enemies of compassion. But before I go further, I want to sort of explore metta a little bit further. It's, first of all, always stress that it's not a feeling. I think it's a big mistake sometimes people make in trying to develop metta. And sometimes you'll be told by the leader, understandably, but perhaps not particularly helpfully, oh dear, I hope I haven't offended anybody, feel metta. But actually, it's not a feeling. It's not necessarily something located in your body in that sort of way. It's not to do with a pulsing heart, although often it's accompanied by that. I find there's sort of a warmth in my heart when I'm feeling metta. But metta is, properly speaking, a desire. In fact, it's defined in Buddhist psychology as a karma. That is an action of the mind. And it's the action that consists in the desire for the well-being of others, independent of your own interests. So it's a disinterested desire for the well-being of others, which is not coming from your own self-concern. It sort of moves beyond that. And it begins when you begin to put yourself to one side, to some extent, which is what we mostly manage to do when we do the metta bhavana for a few times. We begin to put ourselves aside and enter into a relationship of well-wishing towards the other, whoever it is we're focusing on. But I want to go into it a little bit more deeply because, yes, I've sort of examined this in myself. My own conclusion is that metta and the others as well are entirely natural to us. They're natural to us. They're natural responses that we have to life, to living things, not just human beings, but especially to humans because they're the most like us. But to all life, it's a responsiveness that we have once we set aside our own self-interest, once we really listen to what's going on in the world, where we really listen to other people, really see other people, naturally a response of well-wishing arises within us. So I think it's very important. All life is interconnected. All life vibrates with all life. We're, even here in this room, we're sort of unknowingly kind of tuning into each other and sensitizing to each other. I read somewhere that people on retreat actually begin to harmonize their heartbeats in meditation, for instance. I don't know whether this is true. Certainly, I know that the monthly periods tend to align to the inconvenience of many retreats. But there's a sort of natural responsiveness which draws people into harmony in a certain way. It's completely natural when you set yourself aside, when you stop paying attention to your own idea of yourself's insistent demands. So in a way, the development of metta isn't so much making something happen, It's more allowing something to happen. I don't know whether you've experienced this, especially in the fifth stage. There comes a point where, if those of you who don't know, in the fifth stage of the metta bhavana, you allow your metta, your desire for the well-being of others, to flow in wider and wider circles throughout the whole universe. And what many people find fairly early on even is that it's sort of happening spontaneously. It's not something you're sort of heaving metta out of your heart like that, which sounds dangerous and painful. But you're sort of clearing away the obstacles so that it just flows naturally. And at that point, it just flows, which of course is taking us into another dimension, which I'll go on to a bit later, if I can manage to restrain myself from digressing too much. So metta is the absolutely basic human emotion, if you could call it emotion. It's not really an emotion, as I say, desire. If we clear ourselves away, we naturally desire that others are well. We naturally feel in tune with them. But we're so much involved with ourselves that we have to make an effort to allow that to happen. Karuna is metta, but it's metta that's directed to those who are suffering. So that when we are, as it were, vibrating with someone whose experience is pain, we experience compassion, which is a desire that their pain ceases, that they're taken away from their pain. In a phrase that's commonly used in meditation practice, may they be free from their suffering with its causes, because everything arises in dependence on conditions. So it's not just that you want them to be happy regardless, you want them to have the conditions out of which happiness comes. So, that freedom from suffering comes. So compassion is this basic human sense of solidarity, which is entirely natural to us once we get ourselves, at least temporarily, a little bit out of the way. Compassion is that natural responsiveness when it's directed to somebody who's suffering. And it leads you to wish that they are freed from their suffering. Mudita is that same basic emotion when it encounters somebody who's happy. When you encounter somebody who's happy and your metta is flowing, you're happy for them. You join them in their happiness and you rejoice with them in their happiness, regardless of your feeling. That's the thing, all these can be felt, or can be experienced rather, independent of how you are. You can be not in a good state. You can be unhappy and still feel metta. You can be unhappy, suffering yourself, and still feel compassion. And the same with mudita. Upeksha, as I've said, is more this sense of non-reactivity. So that, yes, you do sympathize, you empathize with the suffering of others, but you don't sort of enter into it. You don't let it invade you, or it doesn't invade you. It doesn't take you over, which is, of course, the most difficult thing when you're dealing with a lot of suffering. You just get overwhelmed by other people's suffering, which doesn't help, really. So, yes, compassion is one of these four emotions. I'll deal with the fifth, which is not usually included in the four. But there's also a responsiveness, a natural responsiveness, when we encounter quality, when we encounter virtue, when we encounter beauty. It's of the same kind. When you encounter someone who, to some extent, embodies qualities, real human qualities, there's a natural feeling of reverence that arises within you. And that, of course, from the Buddhist point of view, has its highest manifestation in one's response to the Buddha, as shraddha, as faith in the Buddhist context. So I hope we're a bit clear about what we're talking about when we're talking about compassion, and therefore also clear what we're talking about when we're talking about metta and mudita and upeksha. But I want to talk about these near enemies because they are what I so vividly exemplified in those two situations I spoke of. So the near enemy of metta, of loving kindness, is of course attachment. So that you think that you love the other person. But the strange thing is when they dump you, you don't love them anymore. In other words, it's not really to do with them, it's to do with you. In fact, it often turns to hate. So love of that kind, let's call it attachment, is shown by its the ease with which it converts into its opposite. So yes, that's the near enemy of metta. And I very often hear this. People talk about feeling metta. What they really mean is they feel attached, they're romantic or whatever. It's not metta. It's not bad. It's what makes the world go round, what keeps the human race going, and so on. But it's not metta. That's okay. Just let's call it by its name. I don't, we all got reactivities and we all got these normal human emotions and so on, but let's just not try to dress them up as something that they're not. The near enemy of karuna, of compassion, that is either pity, condescending. I felt some of that in Moldova. I was up here looking down on them, a poor people, they're suffering. That's pity. It's condescending, patronizing, and really not allowing yourself to enter fully into a direct human relationship. You preserve yourself by standing aloof and above. Then, but there's another one which is I also demonstrated, which is this sort of horrified desire to do something, which is not to do with. It's to do with me, really. It's wanting to displace my own discomfort in the place of such horror, in the face of such horror. I wanted to get myself out of that unpleasantness by thinking of something that could be done. It's not that you shouldn't think of something to be done. It's not even that you shouldn't do something. But you should be trying to do it from the right motive, from the right base. Because then one would be so much more effective. I remember once giving a talk in a part of India where there's very bad casteism, and I was giving a talk to a group of people who are followers of Dr. Ambedkar, and I started talking about metta. And in fact, I was going to lead the metta. And somebody just sort of raised their hand and said, look, I'm not going to experience metta towards those caste people who are oppressing us. No, I'm not going to do that. So I did my level best to explain what I meant and so forth. Eventually, my translator got fed up and just said in very vigorous Hindi, Maitri majboote, majboote. Majboot means strong. Metta is strong. So that actually, if you've got metta, you're stronger, you're better able to deal with a situation because you're not sucked into it. Even more, that could be said of karuna. Karuna, compassion, real compassion is strong. Majboot, it's a wonderful word. So you are able to be fully engaged, you're able fully to take in what's going on, you're fully a human being with other human beings, and at the same time, you're doing what you can to help without any sense of superiority, with a kind of sense that if I was in that situation, somebody would help me. With mudita, it's a bit easier, isn't it? The near enemy of mudita is a kind of artificial, excited rejoicing. Do you know the sort of thing? You've done something and people say, oh, that was really wonderful. And, it's way over the top. And you can feel the lack of genuineness in it. And really what they're thinking is, I wish I'd done that. And, the far enemy, which is jealousy, is not far behind that. But it masquerades as mudita. With upeksha, the near enemy is indifference, of equanimity, that great British emotion, indifference. What's the name of that comedian? I can't remember her name. Not bothered. Yeah, you can know the reference anyway. Not bothered. Look at my face, not bothered. So, that was quite good, wasn't it? So you're just not letting it in. You're just not letting it in. And oh yeah, okay, well, there we are, suffering, whatever. We need to be so careful that we don't dress up our quite ordinary and perfectly understandable egoistic responses as something spiritual. And we don't use this big term. You shouldn't have your shoes on when you use it. Compassion. It's a big word. And it really does imply something in which you have got a little bit out of the way and where there's something very, very human going on, very kind of intimate almost, just human to human, and a sense of solidarity, and a sense that within that solidarity you're faced with somebody's suffering and you want it to be removed. And of course, if you can, you do what you can to help. But if you can't, well, you can't, if you see what I mean. You don't have to try to do something if you can't do anything. So, very, very important, I think, to get very clear about these terms and to use them quite precisely and clearly. Love is a big one, isn't it? It's really elastic. I'd love a cup of tea. Which is not metta, I assure you. Right the way through. But, well, metta, that's why we always choose to say metta rather than love, because love in general English usage is so overworked. Although, unfortunately, it's such a beautiful word, as it implies something so beautiful. But we maybe should try to use it only where it is in connection with this genuine human response of impartial well-wishing towards another, which isn't to do with me. So we try to develop these emotions. We try, therefore, to be also clear about them in our own lives, in our own usage. Language shapes experience. So it's very important that we be very careful when we use these sort of terms and don't overuse them, and be cautious when other people use them. Because if somebody says, oh, I'm doing this out of compassion, you can't argue with them. Your ground has been taken away from them. But the plain fact is they're probably not. They're probably doing it for votes or for people to think how compassionate they are, or, which is all quite understandable. I do thoroughly selfish and egoistic things. And if I do, then everybody else must. Let's be careful about our language. This is one of the things that we learned from our teacher, is care about language, because language shapes experience. And imprecision in language causes great confusion, but also sort of shapes our own interior experience. So let's use these terms more precisely in the Buddhist context. But it doesn't end there. We're all trying to develop this. We're all trying to work with this. We're trying to develop more and more deep human connections where we're able, in our connections with others, to get ourselves a little bit out of the way and meet just human being to human being, not ego to ego, bashing away. But Buddhism teaches us, the Buddha taught us, and it's a key part of the Buddhist teaching, that compassion can go very deep indeed. It can go as deep as enlightenment itself. And the Buddha is spoken of as the compassionate one. But it's not even the compassion that I've been talking about up till now. That's a sort of human compassion, where we are, yes, getting ourselves out of the way, but I come back again. When we gain insight into the true nature of things, when wisdom dawns within us, when we gain enlightenment, we get out of the way altogether. There is no sense of a separate self. We stopped thinking of everything as revolving around I. We get out of the way. Get out of the way finally, for good, never again. And then compassion flowers completely naturally. And because from the point of view of one who has gained liberation, one who is enlightened, all who are unenlightened are suffering. From the point of view of enlightenment, unenlightenment is painful. Actually, we all know it. Deep down, we know that life is inherently painful, that there's the pain of being constricted, of being conditioned, of being confined within an identity. And but the Buddha has freed himself from that. And anybody who has reached those heights is free from that. So they see all beings as involved with the deepest kind of suffering. Even if they're superficially happy, even if they're quite deeply happy in a way, they see at the deepest level they're still confined in this prison of conditioned existence, which is the way it's spoken of. And so they feel, the Buddha feels, compassion for all beings, which flows completely naturally. It's not willed. There's no effort to make it happen, no effort to get self out of the way. That's gone, that's happened. There's just a completely natural flow of desire for the well-being of others, a desire that they be free from their suffering. This is distinguished in Buddhist parlance by calling it Maha Karuna. Maha means great. So Maha Karuna is distinguished from ordinary Karuna, which is extraordinary enough as it is. But Maha Karuna, it means great compassion. And when you see the word Maha in Buddhism, it usually indicates that it's involved with shunyata. I won't go into an explanation of that, maybe tomorrow night, if you're very good. But it's as it were, the wisdom dimension of the Buddha's experience, recognizing there is no fixed nature to anything anywhere. And when that arises, compassion naturally flows. And but we need to recognize we've got a long way to go to get there. And we start at least by being clear about what we mean by karuna and metta and mudita and upeksha, loving kindness, sympathetic joy and equanimity. By being clear about those, being clear even about reverence, being clear of it as something deep and natural and beyond our own idea of ourselves, our identity. That's where we start. Then we start to try to bring it about. We practice it. And we practice it in meditation. We practice it in communication, trying to communicate deeply with each other so we go beyond our self-attachment. But there's a lot further to go. There's a whole Buddhist path to travel in which compassion in this ordinary sense becomes more and more full, becomes so full that at a certain point we just disappear as a separate self. We, of course, still exist empirically as a centre of compassion, if you like, but that is our meaning of existence. In Buddhist tradition, it's said that ordinary beings are born or reborn out of desire. We want an identity. We want to exist again. But the great bodhisattvas, those beings who are on the verge of enlightenment, take rebirth out of compassion. So their sort of motive force is compassion rather than desire. So that's what we're working towards. We're working towards Mahakaruna, which is apparently a realizable goal. Don't worry about goals and things like that. Just keep trying to develop Karuna by especially developing Maitri. Without Maitri, no Karuna. And gradually, you'll find yourself more and more naturally feeling metta, and therefore more naturally responding to situations of suffering. And also thereby being more able to do something creative in response to them. Maybe not to that situation, but in a way to the fundamental problem. But that's a subject for another day. But I hope that you're at least all clear what, as Buddhists, we mean by compassion. I hope that I've shared my view of it enough with you to convince you, and that you will be very careful when you use the word, and you'll cringe when you hear it used, irresponsibly, and in a way that, in a way, is sort of manipulative. But it is absolutely fundamental to our Buddhist practice, so it's very important that we're clear about it. And I hope that I've helped to clarify it to some extent for you. Thank you.